Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a record-breaking crowd. When I spoke to Camille earlier this morning, she says she's had a terrible time putting this together because the more she reads about it, the more she wants to read about it. So the most difficulty that she had was to get everything into this small space of time. Now, Camille started her career with Anglo Gold Ashanti before spending time as a consultant with Shango Solutions and SRK. Later, she joined NEDA Engineering Group as their lead geologist and hydrogeologist, and then Itasca Africa as senior information geologist. Currently, Camille is a senior hydrogeologist at Nightpisol, South Africa. She's driven to increase her knowledge in the mining, in environmental geology, hydrogeological fields. Working in the water and engineering industry, she has developed skills in geological modeling to feed into both hydrogeological and engineering stability investigations and provides a link between geological and environmental aspects in the mining and construction industry. Her ambition is to enhance the understanding of the relationship between groundwater, geology, and engineering aspects of any earth investigations, from construction through to underground mine water management. She has a keen interest in nature and enjoys going for hikes, cycling, and being active outdoors doing various sporting activities. She says she's lucky enough to be able to have a hobby on photography, where she's currently focusing on bird photography. Nolene follows her on Instagram and says if she ever gave up her day job, she could take this up as a profession. Over to you, Camille.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, I have a very big interest in Andrew Geddes Bain. I hope that it comes through in this presentation. As Henny actually said, it was very difficult putting it together because there's so much history behind it and so much available information on Andrew and obviously his son Thomas. And the links that I sort of got through and got sucked into history, and I struggled and stressed to put this together because I've just ended up reading till like 11 o'clock at night just on the history. So there is a lot of information here that is not included in my presentation, but it is something that I would love to build on in the future, just to get a bit more understanding of Andrew Geddes Bain, the greatest amateur to be associated with the Geological Society, and indeed one of the most important geologists in the history of the country, was that beautiful character, Andrew Geddes Bain. So this is a quote from Brown from the History of Science Endeavour in South Africa. And it's really one of the best introductions for Andrew Geddes Bain going forward. So Andrew was born in 1797 and died in 1864. Sorry, just going to the next slide. Okay, so he did give me a nice introduction there. So I'm Camille Kraak, and I've pursued my career essentially in geology. And in the later years, from about 2012, I ventured further into hydrogeology, which I've been doing to the day. I'm working for Nightpisol at the moment as their senior hydrogeologist, and yeah, geology and environmental and structures have always been such a big passion of mine. And I kind of know where I get it from. I am a descendant from Andrew Geddes Bain. So my line goes Andrew Geddes to Thomas Charles, Francis Geddes Bain, down to Nellie Oakley, Niku Mayberg, not even saying my own down to my father, Johan Mayberg, and there you find me. Obviously, my surname's changed now because I've been married. So we are introducing the Kraaks into this long line of descendants from Andrew Geddes Bain. I never knew, actually, growing up, that Andrew Geddes Bain was actually an ancestor of mine. But being the curious explorer that a descendant of Andrew Geddes Bain would be, I was digging around cupboards at home and I found a very interesting safe. I'm not going to say where. One day, my family, my parents had opened the safe to get something out, and I saw this glorious double-barreled gun. So that's where my story begins. But before I go there, let's go on and focus on Andrew Geddes Bain. So I'm just going to turn my video off. Okay. All right, so the beginning. So Andrew Geddes Bain was the only child of Alexander Bain and Jean Geddes. Unfortunately, they both died when he was quite young. So he was then raised by his aunt, who lived in Edinburgh. And as it was quoted, among sturdy folk who lived by fishing and quarrying great flagstones. There he received a classical education, but no vocational training. Could he have kindled that interest in geology and construction from the quarries? I can just imagine a young Bain running around town and going to the quarries with his friends late in the evening. I can just imagine him having seen these massive quarries, these flagstones essentially, and starting to get a bit interested in it there. So while he was in Edinburgh, he served as an apprentice to a saddler, and skills which he brought with him to South Africa. So in 1916, he immigrated to Cape Town, accompanied by his uncle, Lieutenant Colonel William Geddes of the 83rd Regiment, who was stationed in the Cape. So the story where I fit in is the gun, the story, and the broken down telephone. Not much is known about what Andrew did between working in Edinburgh and getting down to the Cape. But this gun has been passed down over generations, and it's a 12-bore hammerless shotgun. And the story goes that the Crown, the King of England, essentially, had this gun commissioned for the visit of the Shah of Persia, which is obviously now Iran, for a hunt. As the story goes, young Andrew worked as a gun bearer for the Shah, and after the hunt, as a gift of thanks, the Shah presented this gun to Andrew. So, if this is in fact true, this could have happened around 1809. At that time, the Fath Ali Shah Qajar was the second Shah of Iran, and he reigned between 1797 and 1834. So he is famous among the Iranians for three things: an exceptionally long beard, a wasp-like waist, and his progeny. During this time, there was the Russia-Persian War, and there were visits to Europe and between Britain and Iran to help with negotiating treaties between Great Britain and Persia, and obviously having that support from Britain against Russia. But now there's no record of the Shah's actual visit to Europe around until later in the 1800s. In 1809, the Miraz Abu Hassan Khan, who was the ambassador for the Shah, was sent to the court of King George III. And there he was a big party animal, apparently. He became a figure of fascination. Many parties were held, trips were done, and if any of you have watched Bridgerton or Downton Abbey, hunting was quite popular. So here's just a few images of Hassan Khan and the endeavors that were happening at the hunting with George III. But will we ever find the truth? There's no documentation of the Shah going to England during that time. And also, George IV was 48 when he became regent, because his father was ill. And it said that his father was mentally unstable. So did he really go hunting in 1809? And the gun also indicates that it was commissioned by the Watson brothers, who were only established in 1875. So there the plot thickens. Where has it come from? We could possibly find the answers in the document here called The Persian at the Court of King George between 1809 and 1810. These are the journals of Hassan Khan, and he apparently documented a lot of what happened while he was there. My thinking is that perhaps the descendants of Andrew Geddes Bain could have been someone else and not Andrew that went through. Because we know that, well, from what I've read, is that there was a sharpshooter who did go to England in 1889. And it says here, for a month to Britain from the 1st to the 29th of July, he travelled more widely and occasionally staying in country houses in the north of England, and also visiting Glasgow and, wait for it, Edinburgh, where Andrew Geddes Bain is from. Let's get back then to the story of Andrew Geddes Bain. This is certainly something that, and this is one of the reasons why it took me so long with this presentation, is because I got sucked into this. So it was really interesting for me. So Andrew Geddes Bain came to Cape Town in 1816, and he was likely on Princess Charlotte, which is pictured here in the background. He was 19 years old when he did arrive in Cape soil, and he was described as somewhat taller than the average man, broad-shouldered with a strong build. And according to his own account, he had red hair and a moustache, very typical of Scottish ancestry, I'm assuming. So here, there's not much about his early days in the Cape. Some speculate that he was training in trades of tanner and saddler, but other references say that he had been apprenticed earlier on when he was still in Europe. But we know that later on he did use this as a skill. He married Maria Elizabeth von Braxstrom in 16 November 1818 in the Grote Kerk in Cape Town. And that's pictured up there on the top left-hand corner, and it still stands today. He had 3 sons and 7 daughters. He then moved to Graaff-Reinet in 1822 and bought property there. And he carried then on the business of being a saddler, and according to some, later became an innkeeper there. During his time, he often contributed articles to the SA Commercial Advertiser of Cape Town and later to the Grahamstown Journal. He became interested in road engineering and undertook, without charge, so for free, to supervise the construction of the road through Overberg and Van Rynveld passes. Funds were contributed from the various farmers in the area, and it was so successful that the inhabitants presented him with the medal. So while still in Graaff-Reinet, he made a long, dangerous trading expedition over the Orange River to Kuruman. Then, in the company of John Werner Biddulph, also an 1820 settler, he penetrated in as far as Malopelela in the Botswana land. Goodness gracious. In 1829, these 2 explorers made an expedition from Grahamstown all the way to Umzimbubu River in Pondoland. But Bain's last and most hazardous trip was to the Malopa River, where Mafeking now stands. While on one of these expeditions, he's hunting elephants in what is now known as Botswana. And apparently his Griqua wagon drivers stole some of Mzilikazi's cattle. Obviously, not very impressed by this, he sent his tribal warriors, and they attacked his camp and destroyed all of Andrew's equipment and collections and stole his oxen. So Bain kept a journal of this latter expeditions, which have been printed, and I've managed to see, I think, just one of them at the moment, but it is something that I still want to go and explore further. So now, to curb his financial loss, he became a soldier. His first active duty assigned was the 6th Border War of 1834 to 1835, also known as Frontier Wars. During the war, Bain served as captain in the Graaff-Reinet Mounted Burghers, and later in the Fort Beaufort levies, where he was in charge of Fort Thompson on the Taumi River. So pictured here are some images from the Frontier War, and at the bottom here you can see a painting of a group of British soldiers. And according to Beggs 2014, one of them could actually be Andrew Geddes Bain, which is quite interesting. Sorry. After the war, he was awarded a farm in the Adelaide district by the government in recognition of his military service. Bain then sold up his house in Graaff-Reinet to build a house on the farm and started an irrigation system where water is tunneled through to the crops, quite innovative for the time. After 1 year the government decides to restore ownership of the land to the Xhosas, and Bain had to relinquish all of this work without any payment to offset the loss. Kind of sounds familiar. After he obtained then the book titled Principles of Geology in 1937, he became interested in the subjects of geology that would later serve his interest in fossils as well. In 1938, he can rightly be called the father of South African paleontology. His first fossil discovery was done in this year, famous for a fossil he discovered with a very impressive jaw filled with teeth, which he named the blink-bottom monster. This fossil was later housed in the British Natural History Museum. So this monster was would serve as the first known example of an upright walking vertebrate animal. Bain is also attributed to the discovery of freshwater fish in the Eastern Cape Rocky, and it was actually named after him, the Sandila Bainsi, if I've pronounced that right. Now, this is also something that got me sidetracked, and I believe that looking into his paleontology life deserves a whole story on its own. So now going into what Andrew is probably just as famous for is the mountain passes. So in 1843, the self-taught Andrew Geddes Bain was appointed the engineering inspector of the Cape Roads Board. He was involved in surveying, planning, construction of 14 network roads and 7 major mountain passes between 1932 and 1958. 1832 and 1858. One of the most important ones that he did have was for the Queen's Road between Grahamstown, Fort Beaufort, and other military roads through Pluto's Vale to Breakfast Flay. All of this done during the Frontier Wars. The Eka Pass and Fish River Bridge was part of this construction, and at the time was the largest bridge in Africa. And I think that is a huge achievement. There is a plaque in his honor, the head of the pass. And this is also where the Eka group was named and discovered, which comprises of the 250-million-year-old sedimentary rocks. During this time, with the Royal Engineers, he became very interested in geology and paleontology. Obviously, working with the Karoo group rocks, Karoo supergroup rocks, you are finding many, many fossils in those units. So in 1844, he sent some of his work to the Geological Society in London with an account of the geology of the Eastern Province, together with a collection of fossils. So from here, not only the father of paleontology in South Africa, but the father of geology, because he was the first to attempt to give a geological picture of the Cape Colony. For this, he was given grants by the Geological Society of British government to further his work. So for 27 years, while he was building passes and that, he obviously had these great opportunities to look at the geology, find fossils, etc. So not only was he now building passes and roads, he was enlightening himself and others. So firstly, pictured here in the top right-hand corner is one of the cross sections that he's drawn from the Eka group. There is right at the bottom here, you've got a cross section through the mountain ranges, where he then explains what the geology is in one of his letters to the Geological Society. So by 1851, Andrew completed a map and memoir of the geology of South Africa. And a year later, he declined the post of Geological Surveyor of the Cape because he preferred to build roads. And I don't necessarily blame him. Being able to travel and further explore and further get information on geology and paleontology as well seems like a much more interesting endeavor. So nevertheless, he assisted the government by reporting on the copper mines in the Makwaland. So, and Bain then subsequently wrote the Reminiscences and Anecdotes, Geology of the Western Province, and finally, Geology of the Eastern Province. Perhaps his best known literary work is the Kiekie-Kekelbeek, first recited in 1838. And sorry to disappoint you all, I am not performing that. So this is a beautiful image of one of Bain's maps, and you can see that it's quite extensive, obviously focusing on the Cape Colony. And it's very similar to what we have today. It's absolutely beautiful. Okay. Let's go through some of the passes that he did build that, that really highlights his work. So one of them is Michell's Pass in 1848. The road pass was planned by Charles Collier Michell, hence the name Michell's Pass. He was a surveyor general of the Cape of Good Hope. The pass was constructed in 1848 by Andrew Geddes Bain with the use of prison laborers. So in the 1840s, he began working on Michell's Pass when he began to contemplate a pass through Wellington's mountains. That actually went on a track through the one pass, and he started then to design or to envision essentially the pass that will later become known as Bain's Kloof. So Bain completed Michell's Pass in 1848 and moved his team to Wellington, where he built a construction village at Eerste Tol, which is still, some of the buildings in that still stand today. The settlement included usual storerooms and workshops, as well as a hospital, a church building, and recreational areas and stables. So what's interesting is that although laborers were prisoners, they were paid for their labor and were given their money when they were released from prison. As it was a priority to finish the roads, they were given a lot of assistance and were treated apparently humanely, or what we hope to think that they were treated humanely. And that's sort of where the system of punishment, reward and punishment was established, which was used to control the prisoners while they worked. Work started in February 1849 on Bain's most famous pass, and probably it's most famous because it's named after him. And it provides a more direct route from the town of Wellington to the more northern towns of Ceres and Worcester. Excuse me if I can't pronounce certain names. So they started on the easier western approach, and the section required blasting, 2 timber bridges, and 4 stone culverts. It's really, really fascinating how much work went into these, and not only the building and the construction, but we all know those mountain passes. They are incredibly treacherous, steep, and geologically beautiful. He also then planted 300 oak trees for shade, which I really like, because it shows that there is some environmental management side there of him. But it was all through these Knysna forests as well. So most of the work was done by the convict labor, so between 300 and 350 people at a time, and about 1,000 convicts could claim that they were involved in building this 30-kilometer pass. Well, as part of the Wellington side as well. So the pass was opened in September 1853 and is still in use today, obviously with a few minor improvements like its hard surface. It is the only pass called after the engineer, sadly, but having stood the test of time, it is now a national monument. Just a side note, Bain's Cape Mountain Whisky is distilled at the James Hedrick Distillery in Wellington. It was named after Bain in honor of his construction of Bain's Kloof Pass. And yeah, I think that is also a fantastic thing to have under your belt. So I love these pictures as it shows the same angle, obviously different years. I believe this photo isn't from when they were constructing it, obviously a couple of years later. But I love how you can see how not much has changed on the path, only that it was being tarred. So it really stands to show how well these roads were constructed. So here's a list of the mountain passes that are attributed to Andrew. So you've got your first one, your Overberg Pass near Graaff-Reinet that he did for free. The Van Reinfeldt Pass, Eka Pass as described earlier, Michell's, Bain's Kloof, Geddes Pass, Hoek Pass, and Katberg Pass. He obviously worked, as we know, as part of his descendants, he worked a lot with Thomas Charles Bain, which is also one of my ancestors. So between 1848 and 1863, Thomas was an apprentice to Andrew, so he trained under him, which I suppose is one of the best training you can get. So after passing the first of the government examinations, he was promoted to roads inspector. In 1857, they went to survey a route for a new path. The route chosen may have partially followed an elephant trail formed by the parades of majestic creatures. And this was back when the Knysna forest obviously stretched a lot further across South Africa and across Karoo there. It's obviously been reduced to only a small area now, which is very sad. So through this, they had a multitude of technical problems. So the cost of it was very, was large, but they were luckily still given the go-ahead.
Construction of the pass began in 1863, with light traffic starting to use the completed sections in 1867. The official opening date was on the 29th of September, 1868. Initially known as the Knysna Road, it was finally named Prince Alfred's Pass in honor of Queen Victoria's second son, who came elephant hunting in the forest of Knysna in September 1968.
So now this is in the later years with Andrew. Thomas then moved his whole family to the farm in De Vught. And with, again, the use of convict laborers, they started work on their phenomenally long pass in 1963. During 1864, he received a 1 year's worth of paid sick leave. Geez, couldn't we all do with a 1 year's worth of leave? Unlike all the retired folk in the talk, I'm still working. He returned to England for his recovery, and he wanted to go to the geological conference there. Unfortunately, he was too sick to attend and had to return down to the Cape before his leave was over. Bain was too weak to return to Katberg and lived in Cape Town, where the Smith, his in-laws of the son Thomas, took care of him until his death on the 20th of October in 1864. So he's buried in Somerset Road Cemetery, and when this was demolished, his remains were moved to the Maitland Cemetery. So this is also where I speculate that Andrew could have taken family with him back to London, England, essentially, and potentially a young lad who would be the gun bearer to the Shah of Persia. His love for the veld was expressed beautifully in 1857. Now I have been a great traveller in South Africa for tens of thousands of miles with a bullock wagon between my home, and consequently I know something of outspanning, which is to me an ever-recurring source of delight. For use doth breed a habit in man, the shadow desert, and shadowy desert, unfrequented woods, a better brook than flourished peopled towns. Here I can sit, alone, unseen of any, find tongues in trees, books in running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you very, very much, Camille. Okay, guys, questions?
And just to get it going, tell me a little bit of background of your family. I mean, you obviously also had an interest in geology. Where did you grow up?
My parents actually grew up in Somerset West, and you can see it. You can trace it back to moving from the Eastern Cape through to Somerset West. Growing up with my folks, we ended up moving to Michell, and I've always been fascinated with natural sciences, essentially. Even as a kid, I would choose National Geographic over Cartoon Network, and actually when I was in standard 7, grade 9, where we had to choose our subjects, I immediately chose geography. And I was, I was like so excited. And then I found out that my dad had chosen exactly the same subjects. And this was around the time where I had, discovered my ancestry of Geddes Bain, and I just found it so fascinating that interest in earth and natural sciences almost seems, genetic.
And where did you go to school? Where did you go to school?
I went to school in Pietermaritzburg, was high. I went to high school. I grew up in Mandini, a small little town off the coast.
Okay, and a question from Anthony Keane. I think he missed out. What was the name of that very long pass described at the end?
No, the long one near the end that Thomas worked on, it wasn't Bain's Kloof.
Wasn't that long pass? Did they also do Meyringsport?
Possibly. I won't be able to say now. I'll have to go back to my notes.
And have you gone and then driven some of those passes, or is that on your list of things to do?
Yes, certainly on my list of things to do.
John, I just think an interesting thing also is that Bain must have been fluent in, let's say, the Afrikaans of that time, because I think he's credited with writing some of the first in Afrikaans with that Kaji Kettleback, which contributed to some Cape Town newspaper, which is credited as some of the first Afrikaans writing in South Africa.
Yeah, look, I mean, he was obviously a very versatile and an amazing character. When you look at the breadth and depth of his, his work from building road passes, and some of us have the good fortune to have driven those road passes. And there's also a presentation that Martin Etzebeth did for us in December last year on road passes of the Western Cape, including some of Bain's passes. But if you look at the quality of construction, that it's absolutely remarkable. And that's why they've also been able to upgrade them, into modern roads. And then look at his paleontology. And if you look at some of that work, it's again, world-class material for that time, equally as his map.
Some of these guys actually picked up geology. If you think a guy like Draper as well. I think Draper grew up, I think, in Koelsberg or something like that, and also became a very eminent, geologist.
Yeah, well, I think the great thing about all of those guys, and someone like Andy can also comment, was their powers of observation and ability to then, or write that down in English or Afrikaans. If you look at Eyal de Tooy's writings, and if you go back to localities, and I did it in the Lubombo Mountains, where people like Eyal de Tooy had been, and they described a rock face. When you got to that rock face, you could actually see exactly what they were talking about and how well they had documented it. In fact, you could actually just read their books and look at their hand-drawn sketches. You didn't have to go there.
The fact that he got married in the Grote Kerk could actually mean he was marrying somebody that was Afrikaans, because the Grote Kerk has always been Dutch reformed ever since it was built.
I think Maria van Bakstrom was an Afrikaans lady.
Yeah. Julia Heideman's got her hand raised. Julia, question from you?
I just want to relate a wonderful story that I found in Colin McRae's book, Life Etched in Stone, the book about fossils, in which he describes Thomas Bain, his discovery of the Blinkwater fossil, that very important fossil, and how he had to deal with the local church community who were rather suspicious of his activities. Colin says that he invited them to come and see this monster. When he was asked to explain where these bones could possibly have come from, he said that the bones were probably just those of animals that fell out of Noah's Ark, as it was passing over Graaff-Reinet in the Great Flood. And apparently this pleased the members of the delegation, and Bain was left to excavate in peace, possibly even with their blessing.
Wow.
And this was 20 years before Darwin's Origin of the Species was published.
Fantastic. We should also ask Deirdre Richards. I think she was on earlier, but you know, Deirdre and particularly Robin Richards are also a family of Bain. Have you ever met them, Camille?
No, I haven't had the privilege of meeting them. I did correspond with Deirdre briefly.
Yeah.
And she also then introduced herself and her descendancy. So they come from also Thomas Charles Bain, but it was Francis's sister that married a Lister, I believe, and that's her roots that she came down. And funny enough, she knows of 2 others in her family that were geologists.
Yeah.
Well, if that is what you guys are happy with, then this is only the first of the talks on the history of South African geology. Next week, Tony Boniface will be coming to us with the first geological map in South Africa, which very much ties into today's talk. So we're all looking forward to that and hope to see as many of you back here in a week's time. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much again, Camille, for giving us such an interesting talk.